Morning everyone, and welcome to our first concurrent session on cybercrime. It's great actually to have the opportunity to follow Rutger's presentation this morning. His work and the work of his colleagues from the Netherlands in particular has really helped shape the work that we've been doing around the human factor of cybercrime. The AIC's research program is very focused on the offenders who exploit digital technology to commit offences. I'll talk a little bit about some of that work we have planned in that space. The victims who are vulnerable to exploitation and particularly the flow-on effects of cybercrime. I'm going to talk a lot about the harms from cybercrime as part of this presentation. And also looking at the institutional responses to cybercrime, whether that's by law enforcement or someone else. That said, having followed Rutger's presentation, I've got an 8-year-old son who is very, very, very obsessed with getting online to play games at the moment. And so I've got some food for thought. And is currently on YouTube frequently looking at how to beat the opposition in Rocket League. So I've got some stuff to think about. But today I'm going to be speaking about the results from the Australian Cybercrime Survey, which is the cornerstone of our cybercrime research program. And it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the tremendous work of Isabella Voce, who is undoubtedly the engine room behind the ACS. And it would be Bella delivering this presentation if not for the fact that she's delivering multiple other presentations at this conference. So we developed the ACS in response to an identified gap in data on cybercrime. We didn't have a single source of data that measured the different forms of cybercrime that could accurately capture the dark figure of unreported cybercrime, which measured the impact of cybercrime beyond financial losses, or which could provide sufficient detail to help inform our targeted prevention efforts. We piloted the survey back in 2021 before conducting the first survey in 2023 and repeating it again last year. The ACS has been developed over several years with the input of many of the agencies that are at this conference today. There are several components to the survey, which is conducted by Roy Morgan Research. First, there's a core survey, which is completed by a minimum of 10,000 respondents each year and measures cybercrime victimisation, help seeking and harms. That's a demographically representative sample of the spread of the Australian population. We then have a number of rotating addenda, which are short questionnaires that are completed by a subsample of respondents. These allow us to look at contemporary issues which we might not want to ask about every year, but which might be issues of either to us or to our partners across government. And finally, there's the longitudinal sample. In 2023, we recruited more than 3,000 respondents who will complete multiple waves of the survey. This allows us to measure repeat victimisation, but it also allows us to test the efficacy of certain interventions, and I'm going to come back to this in my presentation. And I want to take this moment to acknowledge that the 23 and 24 surveys were supported with generous funding from the Proceeds of Crime Act program within Commonwealth, and the 2025 and 2026 surveys are funded through the National Cybercrime Capability Fund. And this work simply isn't possible without that financial support. Some of you might recall that we published our first Cybercrime in Australia report in mid-2023, which measured victimisation, help seeking and harm for 4 broad categories of cybercrime: online abuse and harassment, malware, ID crime and misuse, and fraud and scams. In the ACS, we adopt a bottom-up approach to measuring cybercrime, and we ask about various crime types, indicators, or symptoms of behaviour that might fall within these 4 broad categories. What that means is we can produce more reliable estimates of the extent of victimisation because it relies less on individual victims being able to identify and recall what type of cybercrime they experienced. We also introduced a novel measure of cybercrime. So while we showed that nearly half of the respondents experienced at least one form of cybercrime in the 12 months prior to the survey, we also showed that 1 in 4 respondents and 1 in 5 small businesses were negatively impacted by cybercrime in the 12 months prior to the survey. In addition to this report, we've used data from the ACS in a number of additional publications and studies. We recently published our Cybercrime Harm Index, where we used data from the survey to produce an overall harm score for 18 different categories of cybercrime. These scores allow us to measure the relative harm of these types of cybercrime compared to one another. And we can also use these to measure how cybercrime harm is distributed across victims. So we use this crime harm score to show that 11% of cybercrime victims account for nearly 60% of all harm to cybercrime victims. And we use these findings to argue that you can have you can reduce overall harm from cybercrime by a much greater amount if you can identify and target those crimes that have the greatest impact and those victims who are the most negatively impacted. You'll hear more about this when Bella, Emma and Laura present the outcomes of our intervention trial tomorrow. The AIC partnered with eSafety and the AFP to test the effect of targeted prevention message through a randomised control trial using the longitudinal sample recruited through the ACS. And you're also going to hear about another 2 studies that draw on the ACS, and specifically the survey addenda. The first is our research on ransomware, including how it affects small to medium businesses and how victims respond, using data collected as part of the 2023 survey. Results from the AI addendum, including an experiment to test whether people will be less likely to misuse AI when there is a risk of detection, are also being presented at the conference by Alexandra Voce. This was developed with the Attorney General's Department and included in our 2024 survey, where we also had a questionnaire on pathways to scam victimisation developed with the National Anti-Scam Centre. We also made a number of improvements to the core survey as part of the 2024 survey. First, we worked with the National Anti-Scam Centre, NASC, to improve the way we measured online fraud and scams and to better align our measurement of fraud and scams with the NASC's scam typology. We changed the way we ask about help seeking so that, as well as asking whether someone sought help, advice or support from police and ReportCyber and other authorities, we also asked them whether they submitted an official report. And because this is the second time we've run the ACS, we report on key changes in certain measures over time, including victimisation, online safety, help seeking and harm. Overall, in many ways, the results from the 2024 survey mirror those from 2023. We found similarly high rates of victimisation. Certain vulnerable sections of the community continue to be overrepresented among victims, and subcategories of cybercrime that were common in 2023 were also common in 2024. Rates of help seeking are still low, meaning that administrative data still significantly underestimates the scale of the problem. For example, using our new measure of official reporting, we found that around 1 in 10 victims made an official report to either police or ReportCyber. Slightly higher for fraud and scams, but still only around 1 in 8 victims. And this is despite the fact that many victims experience both financial and non-financial harms from cybercrime. This includes individuals and also small to medium businesses who continue to report a wide range of harms to their business from cybercrime. But in this presentation, I actually want to focus on what we observed in terms of changes between 2023 and 2024. First, we compared the prevalence of cybercrime among respondents to both surveys. We limited our analysis to those cybercrimes that we measured consistently in both years, and we also used a statistical method that allows us to essentially account for differences or observable differences between our 2 samples. Overall, we found that the prevalence of online abuse and harassment, malware and fraud and scam victimisation was lower among 2024 respondents than it was in 2023. There was no difference in the prevalence of ID crime and misuse or in terms of the overall prevalence of cybercrime victimisation. But there were differences in several subcategories of cybercrime. There was a decrease in the proportion of victims who received unsolicited sexual content online, who were a victim of suspected malware that was not related to ransomware, and who were a victim of a phishing scam. While we have no way of knowing for sure, one possible explanation for the reduction in unsolicited sexual content is the considered national response to sexual victimisation on dating apps that we've seen over the last 18 months. There was no change in other common crime types, including the compromise of financial accounts, online shopping scams and investment scams. And while it was trending downwards, there was no significant change in ransomware victimisation, whether that's pure ransomware or ransomware-related data theft and extortion. The only subcategory of cybercrime where we saw a higher proportion of victims in 2024 was ID crime and misuse that was not related to compromise of financial accounts. We also saw a decrease in the proportion of victims who experienced more than one of the 4 broad types of cybercrime in the past year, from 43% of victims in 2023 to 39% of victims in 2024. Unfortunately, we can't really tell whether these are respondents who experienced more than one type of cybercrime as part of the same incident, whether there were different types of cybercrime that were connected but didn't occur as part of the same incident, or whether the respondent was a victim of multiple unrelated incidents of cybercrime. But it may be that this represents a fall in the rate of repeat victimisation. There has been a rise in help seeking among victims, which I'll talk about shortly, and victims who seek help following an incident may be more likely to implement online safety strategies to prevent them from falling a victim a second time. But obviously we need to do work to measure the effect of these support strategies for victims in terms of their effectiveness in reducing repeat victimisation. Now, all of our research and research undertaken internationally has shown that small to medium businesses are especially vulnerable to cybercrime. We know they're desirable targets for offenders, in part because they don't have the infrastructure or capacity to thwart would-be attackers. We observed a number of positive changes for small to medium businesses who participated in the 2024 survey. For example, respondents who owned, operated or managed a small to medium business were less likely to be a victim of malware and online fraud and scams in 2024 than they were in 2023. Online fraud and scam victimisation decreased from around 15% of respondents in 2023 to 12% of respondents in 2024. We also observed a decrease in data breaches. In 2024, a quarter of respondents said they had their information exposed in a data breach in the 12 months prior to the survey. This was significantly lower than in 2023, when nearly 34% of respondents had their information exposed in a breach. This means there were 26% fewer respondents who experienced a data breach in 2024 than in 2023. And that's significant because we've also got research that shows data breaches increase the likelihood of further cybercrime victimisation. Of course, this was actually after a threefold increase in data breaches between 2021 and 2023, so we still have some way to go in terms of bringing this figure down. The decrease might be because large companies are becoming more vigilant in response to the public scrutiny that followed the large-scale breaches, such as those affecting Optus, Medibank and Latitude Financial. But people might also be becoming less willing to provide information, particularly sensitive information, to private companies when they're not required to do so. However, and I think this is probably the most important finding that's come out of the 2024 survey, at least in my view, is that respondents were less likely to use online safety strategies in 2024 than they were in 2023. That's despite there being evidence of increased use of higher risk platforms by the same group of respondents. Now, we don't know why this is the case. We even observed a similar pattern in our longitudinal sample who completed both the 2024 and 2023 surveys. We've previously shown that people who use online safety strategies are more likely to fall victim to cybercrime. That's probably because they take steps to improve their online safety after they've fallen victim, or because they use high-risk platforms and are therefore more vigilant when they're online. As I've already shown, we did see a decline in victimisation this year, so it might be one explanation for the difference we're observing, but I'm not convinced by this argument. There may be other factors. So, for example, the decrease in the prevalence of respondents checking and changing their social media privacy settings might be related to the decrease in the frequent use of social media platforms that we also observed as part of this survey. And similarly, the decrease in the proportion of respondents who verified the details of organisations that had contacted them or who had avoided clicking links on people they didn't know, from people they didn't know, may be because of the efforts that have been taken by government and the private sector to block scammers from reaching potential customers or victims, thereby reducing the need to take preventative action. The worst case scenario, though, is that there may be some apathy or even defeatism creeping in, and computer users are becoming less vigilant online. The short answer is that we don't know what's happening, but respondents were not taking important but simple steps to improve their online safety. I mentioned earlier in this presentation that help-seeking rates are low among cybercrime victims, and that's true in terms of official reporting, but also in terms of the proportion of respondents who seek help from police and ReportCyber following the most recent incident. We did see an increase in help-seeking in 2024. The proportion of respondents who sought help from police or ReportCyber following the most recent incident of online abuse and harassment and malware was higher in 2024 than it was in 2023. As you can see from the slide, the increase was even larger for small to medium business owners, operators and managers. They were also more likely to seek help following an incident of ID crime and misuse. There's a lot of encouragement for victims to report cybercrime to police. We know from our data there's still two main reasons that people don't report. One is that they don't feel the incident was serious enough to warrant a report to police. The other reason, and this continues to be true in 2023 and 2024, is that there continues to be some confusion on how and where to report cybercrime. And we didn't observe any significant trends in terms of financial losses from cybercrime, at least in our survey. Among the people who responded to the survey, cybercrime continues to be a high volume and low yield crime, where most people lose a relatively small volume of money, or small amount of money. That's not to say there isn't a significant minority who lose much larger amounts. And of course, what we see is very different to what you see in ReportCyber and ScamWatch and other sources, because we're including people who don't report the most recent incident. Now, while the amount of money lost after recoveries was unchanged, a higher proportion of victims of ID crime and misuse were able to recover at least some of their money following the most recent incident. Given the attention that's been directed at financial institutions in terms of how they respond to cybercrime, this is a positive sign that the response to victims might have improved. Finally, we were really concerned to see that the proportion of victims who experienced any harm as a consequence of cybercrime was higher in 2024 than it was in 2023. And this is explained largely by an increase in social and health impacts, which were both more common in 2024. The increase in social harm appears to be driven by an increase in the proportion of respondents who said they were embarrassed or had their reputation damaged, or who said they'd lost trust in other people. The former suggests we still have some way to go in terms of changing the stigma around falling victim to online crime, while the latter is an important reminder of the potential effects that online crime can have in terms of online and offline relationships. The increase in health harm was driven by increases in the proportion of victims who experienced difficulty sleeping, had to seek medical treatment, increased their consumption of alcohol, or who increased their consumption of illicit and legal drugs as a consequence of being a victim of cybercrime. So while these are still relatively rare harms, cybercrime causes real-world harm to victims beyond the immediate financial losses. So the results from the second Australian Cybercrime Survey show that rates of victimisation remain high, formal help seeking remains low, and a large proportion of victims are negatively impacted by cybercrime. Cybercrime continues to have a disproportionate impact on certain sections of our community. However, there's some promising signs. The prevalence of online abuse and harassment, malware and fraud and scams were all lower among 2024 respondents. Poly-victimisation was also lower this year, and we observed a significant decrease in data breaches. This might be a sign that concerted national effort to prevent cybercrime is having a positive effect. A higher proportion of respondents sought help from police or ReportCyber after falling victim to certain types of cybercrime, and victims were more likely to recover money for ID crime and misuse incidents in 2024. And so hopefully this is also a sign that our response to victims is also improving. Importantly, respondents who owned or operated a small to medium business were less likely to fall victim and more likely to seek help when they did. There are more than 2.5 million small businesses. I think they account for about 99% of all businesses in Australia. So reducing their vulnerability to cybercrime is obviously essential. But we still have some way to go, clearly. Respondents were less likely in 2024 to say they were using various online safety strategies, and there was no change in the prevalence of high-risk online behaviour. Further, a higher proportion of respondents reported being negatively impacted by cybercrime in 2024, particularly for social and health-related harms. So while there are positive signs, it's clear we must continue to evolve, adapt and strengthen our efforts to prevent cybercrime impacting individuals and also small to medium businesses. I want to take this opportunity to briefly mention the work we have planned or underway. We're around a month or two away from entering the field with the 2025 Australian Cybercrime Survey with the support of the National Cybercrime Capability Fund, and we have funding to repeat the survey again in 2026. This year we have two addenda planned. One will measure pathways to offending behaviour among at least 6,000 survey respondents. This will try and better understand the decision-making among people who engage in harmful or potentially illegal behaviour online, and hopefully provide some insight into the baby steps that Rutger talked about in his presentation. A second addendum will survey parents about their perceptions of social media regulation. We're also going to recruit a new wave of respondents in the 2025 survey to participate in a second intervention trial. I don't want to give anything away from Bella, Laura and Emma's presentation tomorrow, but there were some really important insights and lessons from that first trial that really could help shape future crime prevention efforts. We've not yet chosen, this is really shameless sales pitch, but we've not yet chosen or developed an intervention to be tested in this next wave of the survey. And I'd really welcome and encourage people to attend the presentation tomorrow, or to let Bella or I know if you have a proposal or some idea that you'd like to be testing in the area of cybercrime. We've got the infrastructure, but we need the ideas and the expertise of the people in this room. That's all from me. All of our cybercrime research can be accessed by this QR code or via the AIC's website. The Cybercrime in Australia 2024 report will be released at some point in the near future. Otherwise, thanks very much.